Hello there, sword friends. Today I'm going to do an AMA and Ask Me Anything type sword video log blog where I ramble into a camera for a long time. So if that's not your thing, then this is not going to be the video for you. But I'm going to basically answer some of the questions that were posted in the... I'm going to do one of these AMA video things, and these are the comments that came up on the community tab. Just as a future reference, I will try to do some of these videos in the future since people seem to like them a little bit, maybe a little bit. In the future, though, I'm going to post up the AMA and then leave it for a week and then try to make a video a week or longer. It's pretty difficult for me to go back through the old comment section or the old AMA or the old Facebook stuff, so I'm just going to throw something up on the community tab. That's what it'll be in the future, and that's what I'm going to try and answer now. I might go back and try to find a couple extra questions that maybe I missed, but in the future, I'm going to stick to just the community AMA tab that has the questions in it. Anyway, here's that. Swordfriend Peter, what are your favorite three mass-produced European swords? It would be cool if you did a separate video like you did for the katanas. That's a good idea, sir. I have thought about that. That's been a suggestion that people have made, and honestly, I can't think of my three favorite European swords. Again, context is a thing that matters depending on what I'm doing. If I think about like just general cutting, I really like the Type 18C. I've had a few of those. I also really like the Type 18B. I've had a few of those as well, and those are probably, as I pick them up in my hand, have this kind of big, fun, imposing feeling, but also I can use them in a way that I'm vaguely familiar with and have some degree of success. So generally speaking, I suppose those would be like Type would be my favorite. If I think of three specific examples, the Albion Sovereign still remains one of my favorite looking swords, and so that has to go on the list just because it's so darn pretty. If I have an Atrim 1555, it's an older one, it's whippy and weird, but it's long and has reach and is really fun to move around, and I've had a really fun time cutting with it just because it's so big and imposing looking, but really kind of light and agile. And then if I think of third sword, geez, it's tough for me to even think of what the third one would be if I had to think of a specific model. Probably why I should think about it and do a video to for your suggestion. So in the future, sure, yeah. Swordfriend Joey. Another question. What has using a katana boolean, I'm guessing you mean boken, in kata, simulating a real sword fight taught you about weapons? As in, did it make you see them as more or less durable or open your eyes to why they are designed like they are? So if I'm understanding your question correctly, then that you're asking what has using a boken in training sword fighting taught me about why weapons are designed the way they are, or what have I got from that. So there's I suppose a couple different ways that could go. There's some good and bad habits. One, by practicing with wooden boken, I do get a feel for why the sword may be shaped or has some of the characteristics it does. You can learn like how to use the slight curvature to your advantage, or how to use the spine, or some things like that give you some idea about how the sword would move. But you also miss how it binds, how metal swords interact with one another, or that kind of thing. Also, the kata doesn't necessarily help you make sense of why the sword is designed. At least it's not self-evident when you're doing kata. Like, for example, I'll think of like you do some thrust with the blade horizontally and some thrust with the blade vertically, and it's not inherent to me as to why, because I'm also not wearing armor while I do it. But when you thrust this way, you're trying to maybe slide up under a plate that's slotted one way, and when you're thrusting vertically, you're trying to crawl up this little I can't remember what the part of the helmet is called here, but you're trying to slide up under the throat area. So but that's not inherent to me or apparent to me when I'm doing the kata without it being explained to me more directly. So I don't know. There's certainly some things that you can garner just, I suppose, through osmosis, but not all of them. And I think in terms of using wooden weapons to simulate steel ones, there's just pros and cons. It's fun that you can use them and have less likelihood of getting hurt, that they can simulate quasi-similar weights and shapes, and but they don't at all act the same way. And you can also get plenty of bad habits if you don't balance your experience with something with a metal component as well, if having that experience is important to you. It's not that you can't do the martial art with a boken and garner something from it. You just probably have to be smarter than me. Swordfriend Shane, hey there Matthew, love the channel, thank you very much. Here's a question. If you couldn't talk about swords and do destruction tests on YouTube anymore, what sort of content would you be making? What would you be uploading, if anything? Well, I would probably not be making anything. The main premise behind this sword type channel that I've made here is that not a lot of people were making it. There are certainly very articulate and educated voices in the community making content, but I know when I went to go buy a sword, I didn't find stuff about the sword I was interested in buying, and I made a mistake, and it cost me some money, and I was like, hey, I think there's a space for me to help further the conversation and help people with what they want to buy and share my interests, and I can actually add something. But when I think about the other things that I'm interested in, there's just other people doing it better, and I don't think that I have much to add in terms of knives and video games and beer and computers and all that kind of crap that I'm interested in. So I don't think I would be doing anything if it weren't for talking about swords. So there you go. Sword friend pianist Shogun. That, when I say it loud, sounds funny. Have you ever thought to conduct a destruction test on 3 swords by the same maker using 3 different Hamon styles, Saguhan, Atari, Sobuda? I don't know the last one that you're writing, but long and the short of it is, it sounds interesting. I haven't thought of it personally, but I think I get what you're throwing down. You could figure out what benefit, if any, or what differences there are between those 3 different Hamon types and which one may be superior for your sword-related activities. The downside that I can think of is that all other things being equal, would be really tough to get out of any manufacturer. I don't know that I could really make it definitive. I don't know that I have the scientific aptitude or testing methodology to do it, because I don't really have a scientific methodology. I just smash swords. If all things were equal, with the exception of the Hamon, which would also be tough from a manufacturing standpoint. I mean, one sword being half an ounce heavier could yield it some additional benefits that would negate the kind of scientific premise of the question there. But I think there's just enough variation in me as a tester, day by day or minute by minute, that I don't know that I could effectively test which one would be better. I mean, obviously, if one had some glaring superiority, that might become apparent, but shy of that, I don't know that you would be able to garner some value from me testing it. It would be a cool test, though. I'd be interested in the results, but I just don't know if I'm the man to do it. Swordfriend Peter, can you show off all your antique pieces in a video? No. That's just because it would be even a longer Ramblier video. I do have some antique pieces. I enjoy them, but again, I don't think there's as much value. It's interesting to me, and if there's something in particular about an antique piece that you want to know, then throw it in the commentary down below, and I can try and facilitate that video if it's within my realm of competency. But I find myself to be a kind of a crap student of history, and most of those antique pieces, the value in them is kind of the story, the history, and I don't know that that's just, it doesn't seem like I do that kind of content particularly well. I find it very easy to perpetuate misinformation, and I would rather leave that genre to people that are more versed and more studied in it than I am. I do have antique pieces. I find the stories interesting, but I don't know that I can articulate it in a really useful way. And as a buyer, I don't know how interesting it is, because you can't go necessarily buy the piece that I'm talking about, or something from the same school. They're just not necessarily as widely available. But if there is something of particular note that you think I could do well, then throw it in the commentary down below, and I'm certainly happy to explore it. I do have a passion for the antique pieces. I find them fascinating, and I don't know where I could add value in that conversation. And if you see it and I don't, please let me know, and I will endeavor to ramble some more about them. Surfing Joey. Having held and used several high-end katanas and high-end European swords, what would you say is similar and different between them? I know qualities like handling can vary a lot, but maybe some overall tendencies, or maybe areas given more attention on either type, i.e. symmetry or something. I would say one thing that's common about high-end swords and European swords is that when they are high-end, very generally speaking, because you can spend a lot of money on a European sword or a katana type sword and not get something good. It's possible. Generally speaking, it'll be good at something. There's a reason that it's expensive and that it's available at the price, but it may not be the thing that you value. And so there's different strokes for all folks out there in the sword realm. There's things that are favor artistic, fantasy kind of stuff, and things that are tied to history or very valuable antiques, which would certainly fall in the high-end category in some folks' minds. There's performance-based things, and then anyway, so it kind of runs the gambit in terms of what you can get. But generally speaking, I would say if it's a high-end sword, there is some thought that goes behind the dynamics, and I'd say that's one of the common things, that not only do you get worse materials as you go down the line, but you get less thought in it as a weapon. It becomes a thing that is produced, and it has to look like the thing so that it matches the photo, but it doesn't preserve the dynamic intention behind the object, and they can feel very cumbersome or clubbish. Some swords are intended to feel that way, but not all of them. I would certainly argue that there's a lot of mass-produced swords out there that are more cumbersome than they need to be, and that is where the high-end spectrum, I find you tend to get more, is in the sword feeling like a sword, feeling like a weapon, feeling dynamic and agile and refined, and that's, or at least if it does feel weighty, it feels it for a purpose. And that purpose, I think, is often lost on the lower end spectrum. Not always. Symmetry, not always. Again, if you're especially in the European sword or the Japanese sword, the Japanese, you'll find more symmetry and refinement, because there's more examples that suggest that was more common. In the European realm of things, there's people that go for historic accuracy or kind of a handmade, rugged feel. They don't have the same level of symmetry or refinement. Some do, some don't. I wouldn't say that's as common. It's really the thing that's difficult to describe, and that is when you hold it in your hand, it feels like somebody thought about how it should feel versus thought about how it should look only. I think that's about the only common thing that I could think of. Even the artistic pieces very often have some thought on the high end about how they should feel in the hand. Not always, but in most cases, I would say that's kind of the unifying factor around higher end pieces. But they do run the gambit in terms of quality. I think of high end katanas, high end European swords. There's a lot of variety in what gets missed, but it doesn't seem like very many companies kind of check all the boxes, even on the high end spectrum. Certainly some come very close, but not always. Hopefully that answers your question. Sword friend Paul, what is your favorite type of European sword to cut with? Well, probably the Type 18C. Probably because I've used more of those to cut with and compare, so I'm a little bit more familiar. I also like the Type 18B. Either of those have this kind of very long two-handed grip that, well, I don't know if it's a very long two-handed grip, but I can grab them with two hands and cut in a way that I'm familiar with from a Japanese style perspective, and I like those. But that's, given that I haven't had a lot of messers, I would think that if I had more exposure to messers, I would probably like that style more, given that a single-edged, slightly curved blade is probably where my heart lies. But at the moment, if it's a European sword and you asked which one would I want to go cut stuff with, it'd probably be a Type 18C. Ideally with a fishtail pommel, because the wheel one doesn't agree with me so much. All right, sword from Batman. How well can you work a sword, and what are some skills or techniques you are working on? That's a good question. How well can I work a sword? I don't think very well at all. Better than some, but not better than a lot of people that I train with. So the techniques that I'm working on, I suppose there's all of them. If I go into two separate camps, cutting and then just kind of back and forth kata, I struggle to remember to use my hips. It's a constant point. My brain just isn't connected to them, and I constantly have to think about moving my hips, and it's a struggle for me to do that correctly. I also tend to stand tall and don't keep a wide enough stance. Don't know why that is, but those are things that in kata are tough for me to remember. So I tend to fall off balance pretty easily. Syncing with my hips, a lot of hip-related motions. Posture is another one. I am a computer guy and I slouch over, and it's very apparent when I do kata. But correcting my posture and using my hips are something that I am working very diligently to try and do, and failing at, especially now with the world on fire and not having somebody kind of give me a smack upside the head as often as I need. I miss that even more. In terms of cutting, there's a lot that I'm working on there. I have enough struggle just getting a clean 45-degree angle and being able to make it through rokudan-giri, which is if I'm saying it correctly, it's just a cutting pattern where you're trying to do a series of cuts, and I will inevitably cut too low on the mat and not have enough space to finish the technique. I scallop my cuts. I cut in from my right to left much better than I do left to right, and upward diagonal cuts. I'm usually pulling back instead of keeping the sword extended. The goal with doing tamashigiri in the format that I do is to make very clean, precise angled cuts, not to make it through the mat. That is not a huge challenge for me. Generally, if the sword is sharp, I can power through it because of size. So I can cheat on technique, which is not great for me, but I still fail at doing the cut well. So cutting a clean 45-degree angle or clean horizontal cut without scalloping it, without making the mat fly off, is a challenge for me, particularly on the going up from my left to right, or right either way, upward and diagonal. It seems to be misery for me very often. I'll draw the tip through the mat, and that's something I'm working on. Sword friend Brother Man, I like the name, Brother Man. In your endeavors with practicing tamashigiri, you probably butchered the name, but you might have. Yeah, actually, if I read it, my brain corrected it, but I get what you're saying. And Iaido, have you found any production swords that have helped refine your technique? If so, can you elaborate what you look for to accommodate your form and improve your practice? So that's a tricky one, because there's two kind of schools of thought, right? If you think of Iaido, I have some very light Iaido, as in a training sword made of zinc aluminum and not sharp sword. It doesn't have to be made of zinc aluminum alloy, but I have a light one and I have a heavy one, and I have a couple others as well. But the heavy one is not fun to train with, but it does force you to control yourself. And after a month of just using exclusively a very robust heavy Iaido, the light one feels even more controllable, and I'm much more attentive to kind of where I start and stop, because I have to be to not break my wrist using a heavy one. Using a light Iaido I find much easier. I prefer it. I like it a lot more as a training tool, but it lets me work on different things. One forces me to be controlled and measure where I start and stop, and if that's what I need to work on, then a heavy tool helps me do that. If I'm trying to work on speed, then something lighter, or if I'm doing a seminar and there's lots of repetitions, then using a light one behooves me so I don't wear myself out and can continue to learn. In terms of cutting, there are certainly swords that are wide and thick. The Sunway XL geometry pieces seem to be the kind of baseline go-to area for that. They will help in moving through a mat effectively, but again, it depends on what you're trying to do. If you're trying to work on like competitive tamashigiri, where you have really clean, precise angles and you're making cuts exactly where you intend them to be in a particular way, then there's that. But if you're just trying to cut a little bit, or trying to cut in a way that is martial, then use something else. Use something heavier. Maybe it'll force you to be better rather than having the sword do the work for you. You have to have good technique to cut with a more wide, robust, and duller blade. So that might help you actually with your practice. It depends on what you need, and hopefully you know what that is, because then you can find the right tool to help you with it. I prefer a big, wide, thick one that does most of the work for me, because I'm lazy. Swordfriend Walker. Is the show progressing in a manner you get a sword, critique it as only an unbiased American can, America, then destroy the sword in a more uniform manner, standardize the whole process, so there is an expectation of a process new sword evaluation. So if I get what you're throwing down, it is that am I standardizing the process? In short, I would like to, but no, I'm not. Just about everything I do has no scientific methodology behind it, and so my musings on how well it did what it did is probably going to have to be sufficient. As much as I would like standardizing it, time, availability of materials, and how much effort I want to put into it is kind of the limiting factor here. And when I go out to break a sword, I'll go to the dollar store and maybe find some shaving cream cans or something like that, but if I really want to get very scientific about it, I have a lot of difficulty doing that. One thing I am going to try and do is try to do more historic analogies. It's been called out to me by a fellow sword friend that the sword test would be more useful if instead of using it kind of for basic, what a consumer should expect to use it for, and then focusing on breaking it entirely, if I focused on doing kind of more battle scenario or use case scenario and how well it held up as a weapon through that use case, rather than kind of solely focused on breaking it. And I think that shift in focus will hopefully be helpful. Hopefully I can find something analogous to like a shield or wood instead of just logs or basic timbers or something like that, depending on what the sword and its historic use may be applicable to. But I am trying to shift my mindset to make the test more relevant, but I also want to cut materials that are relatable. So yeah, anyway, in terms of standardization, I don't think so. I think it's always going to depend on what I have around and am capable of grabbing and what's convenient. Especially now, like I'm really trying to minimize any additional trips or going to the hardware store or any of that kind of stuff. So at least for the foreseeable future, it is what I happen to have in the shed to cut. Sad as that is. Fortunately, I do have some tatamis left, so I'll be able to at least practice on that. Sword and Chain. More details on Prismic, Katana, and how to buy. So Prismic, you can probably find him on Sword Forum International. That's usually where I'll see him post stuff. I don't see him post on Sword Buyer's Guide anymore, and he has a Facebook page as well that I think I linked. I don't know if he's still active on it, but I don't know if he's still doing stuff actively. I hope he is, because he's a very talented guy, but I haven't seen him put out a lot of new stuff recently. That said, I can't blame the guy for it. The sword market's pretty rough, and if you think about the time and commitment it takes and tools it takes to make a sword, when you're trying to have money to eat, it's not a money making endeavor, so I can't begrudge the guy not spending a lot of time on the sword making, even though he certainly had a talent for it. Anyway, don't know if his website is still up. Or where you can find him, but the last places I've seen Prismic post are usually on Sword Forum International. Sword from Adam. How thin are sword tips actually is? Okay. Are they actually thicker at the very point? Won't break if they're needle sharp? Okay, so if I understand the question right, how thick are tips? Well, I suppose it depends on the sword. Sometimes they get very, very razor thin, and they're very, very pointy and break very easily. I have one of the LK Chen swords, the Tang Tuang. I don't know how to say it. I call it the Tang Dao, or is it Tong Dao? I'm not sure, but it has a very refined point, and it's become bent a little bit, just like the top half a millimeter is bent slightly. Katana can be the same thing. The very tip is the most sensitive part of the weapon, as I'm told, and it tends to be more easily broken. That said, I have some of the Albion blades that have a more refined tip for kind of expanding male rings and still having some penetrating power, and their tips seem quite a bit more reinforced and are pretty robust. And so the sword might have a taper and then kind of just towards the tip expand ever so slightly to be reinforced. It just all depends on what you're going after. And there are some other swords that have much more rounded tips that are much more durable. But if your tip comes to a very, very refined kind of needle point, very thin razor edge, then it's probably going to be quite brittle and easy to break, or easily bent and easily damaged. Sword for an LK Amarin. Citadel Lotus versus Sunway Bamboo Mat Katana. Well, if they're both on a rack and I get to pick one, I'm probably going to pick the Citadel Lotus. If it's my Hanwei Bamboo Mat, the one that's customized, that's a weird... I mean, I really like the Hanwei Bamboo Mat, but bear in mind that I've had like 7, 8, 10 of... I don't even know how many of them I've had at this point. And I've tried to replace the blade that I have, figuring I'm going to do something stupid, so I just want to get another one as a backup, and none of them feel the same way, none of them weigh the same way, and none of them have the same magic that my favorite one does. So if it's my Hanwei Bamboo Mat, then I'm going to pick my Hanwei Bamboo Mat. If it's a Citadel Lotus Katana versus any other of the other 10 Hanwei Bamboo Mats I've had, I'm going to probably pick the Citadel Lotus. But that said, it's kind of like, do you want to have 2 Hanwei Bamboo Mats or 1 Citadel Lotus? Because it is probably more than twice the price, I think, in terms of overall cost. But the Citadel is a little bit more refined an instrument in my mind. It kind of checks more of the boxes in terms of fit and finish. In terms of steel, they're probably pretty equivalent, honestly. But in terms of kind of overall overall level of attention to details, I think the Citadel Lotus is going to beat it. And honestly, I think most people would probably prefer the feeling of the Citadel Lotus to the bamboo mat. That's debatable, but I'm pretty sure that if everyone held the Citadel Lotus and a bamboo mat, they would probably lean at least towards the Citadel Lotus. That said, if you would have a Sunway bamboo mat in your hand and $1,000, more people might choose that. So it depends on which part of that question you want to factor in. Hopefully, I've elaborated it enough. Sword Friend Jack. Hello there, Mr. Jensen. What do you think of the sword market today and of the sword community in its present state? Your videos go back a few years, so I figure you have some perspective on this. Is the sword world different, better, or basically the same? As someone just coming into the sword world over the past 3 years, I feel as though I've missed a lot of pretty cool things. Maybe it's just me, but I feel like 4 to 6 years ago, from what I see on YouTube and in sword reviews, there were some pretty cool swords that are no longer made and I missed out on. Also, it seems there was a more active sword cutting backyard cutting community. Again, based on what I see on YouTube reviews. Of course, I could be 1,000% off on that. I would say, like, if you want to go back, you'd probably want to go back before the 2008 recession, and apparently there used to be a lot more custom makers. That's a facet of the sword making realm of things that I find particularly fascinating, and there seemed to be more of a market for people that could actually make a living making swords. So I think, at least in the Japanese sword realm, there used to be more custom smiths making stuff. Nowadays, a lot of those folks, want to eat and can make better money doing other stuff. So I think we all maybe missed out on that a little bit. But in terms of 3 to 4 or 4 to 6 years ago, I'm not entirely sure on that. You probably missed out on some good deals. There were a lot. The secondhand market was a little bit more robust, at least I think it was. But I don't know that you missed a lot. There's a lot more places to really gather and join and have community. There's Facebook spots. The forums are still active and going. There's YouTube. There's Reddit. There's a whole bunch of places where people can engage and talk about swords. And I think that's pretty cool. I think you're coming into it at a good time. Sword from TSM Space. I don't have any Chinese swords yet, and you posted an LK Chen overview. I wish you would sharpen them up and see what it's like. Would you describe them as light? I don't have any particular preference for LK Chen, and I'm also interested in other swords, but LK Chen appears to be offering value for the money that other Chinese swords do not. I have this image where Chinese swords are overall more appropriate than Euro swords for a modern user because I perceive them as smaller and lighter. People claim that Euro swords are very thick and heavy things, but they feel very heavy to me. It's a long question, so I'm reading through. So I don't think you're crazy for thinking European swords, particularly arming swords, are heavy, especially in comparison to a wakizashi. A wakizashi, debatably, it is a short sword, but it can also be thought of as a big knife. And an arming sword is still a sword. Very often an arming sword blade will still be longer or as long as a katana, which is a two-handed sword. And very often arming swords will be, some of them can be 2 pounds, but some of them can be 3.5 pounds. And that is on the heavy side for a lot of two-handed swords. So I don't think you're crazy for thinking that, depending on what arming swords you've held and moved around. I've certainly had arming swords that I found wildly uncomfortable, and I've had wakizashi that felt incredibly nimble and agile in my hand. So I don't think you're crazy for having that perspective. That's your experience, and that's fine. I have had some arming swords as well that are very light and lively and comfortable in the hand, and I've had some that aren't. I haven't had many wakizashi, in fairness, though, that are beefy and kind of clubbish to move around. Some. I suppose I can think of a couple, but I would say, generally speaking, wakizashi feel more nimble in my hand than an arming sword does. But I don't know that I can compare them fairly because they're pretty drastically different weights and sizes and stuff, and the amount of reach and whatnot that you have. Also, an arming sword is like in conjunction with a shield, and maybe you need that chopping power, so there's a difference of intent versus a waki, which may be a sidearm. Anyway, the LK Chen question, I will sharpen them up. I will use them. It is my intent to do so. My initial impressions right now in terms of them are that they seem to have a sense of something that others lack, and that is kind of distal taper and dynamics. Every sword that I've held from them so far has a pretty cool sensation, a pretty cool feeling, and the geometries are not, even though they appear pretty simple, are a little bit more complex than at first you might expect. I'm still wrapping my head around a couple of them. I'm not terribly familiar with Chinese martial arts or kind of the context in which a lot of these are used, so I'm trying to think about that. But overall, I think that dynamically speaking, they feel like they're built with intent, which is not something I get from every kind of mass-produced sword manufacturer, and something that's really awesome to see in the price point. Now, in fairness, I'm noticing a little bit more flaws than my fellow YouTube counterparts are, and I'll certainly bring those out in the review. But there are some things that I think are perfectly acceptable within the realm of the price point that's being charged. I'm not trying to bash on LK Chin, and I certainly think that they represent a pretty solid value for the money. But you touched on something in this question that you think they may be better for kind of more contemporary use. I recently got the Royal Arsenal Dao, and it's a shorter kind of one-handed little infantry weapon, and the way it feels is really amazing. And if it had some slight changes to it, I think the lack of any kind of stop to move your hand up, or at least as small as it is, really limits its potential for thrusting, which is important. But as a slashing weapon, it feels fantastic in the hand. It moves really well. Matt Easton just did a video on it. I can echo most of what he says. It feels really great in the hand, and it's the only one of the bunch of LK Chen weapons that I would think I wouldn't mind having kind of by the bedside as a home defense kind of weapon. It's missing the stop, which I would say is really important. But it feels applicable to a modern audience. I think a lot of people would hold that sword, and maybe it's a kind of a dainty little thing, but if you think of your intention, which is, I need this to be effective in one particular use case, and then I'll just go buy another one if it breaks, but I need it to be good for at least one use, for a home defense scenario or for something like that. It's a pretty nimble, awesome feeling sword, and it's so small that like moving it in a kind of confined space, like in a hallway, or keeping it close to your body is really, really comfortable to do. It's got a thick enough spine that it doesn't hurt if you kind of brace your hand along the... Anyway, I'm thinking about its uses in other contexts, which are ahistoric, but I will say that the weapon kind of made me feel like, oh, like this... I think a lot of people would really like this, as where the Heavenly Horse Dao is longer, and it doesn't feel like... It feels like I need to know how to move it before I open my mouth. The Frontier Tang Dao is similar to a katana, so it's familiar to me, at least in how to move it. And the Dragon Sparrow is something I've actually had some good conversation with sword friend Philip, who is Akiduka on YouTube. I believe that's his channel name. Anyway, he's given me some perspective on how to move that piece around as a cavalry weapon and how it's drawn and how it might be held, which is kind of making me rewrap my head around how to move it. That said, the Royal Arsenal Dao, I think, fits into what you're talking about question-wise, where it feels like a modern audience would really appreciate how it feels. I wish they made one that's like, here's the historic one-for-one replica, here's some quality of life improvements on a separate version, like the modern context user versus the one-for-one replica. While simultaneously, ideally, preserving the spirit of the weapon in terms of like how it's supposed to move and some of the dynamic characteristics. Really, I don't even mind the ring on it. That's not my favorite, or the small size of the grip. All that, I think, kind of adds a little bit to it. It's really that, like, if I thrust, I feel like I'm going to slide up and slice my fingers. So anyway, hopefully that answered your question about the things. All right, sword friends, that's all I've got for you for today. If you have other questions you'd like to ask, you can throw them in the comments, and I will try to type back and such. I'm getting a few more questions than I can answer these days, but I do try to stay active, and I try to answer. If I miss you, though, I apologize. I will post up another one of these AMA things in the community tab, and I'll try to go through the questions and answer them in a similar format to this. That seems to be about the easiest thing for me to follow. Let me know what you think. Should I be traveling back in time and try to consolidate questions, or is this working out for you? Anyway, that's all I've got for you this time around. As always, cheers, and thanks for watching.